Sometimes I sit and wonder to myself, what qualifies as a legendary amount of victories? Where is that line? What makes you truly top level? And sometimes I wonder, who has the most? Who won more than anybody else? More than Nice, Liboton, De Vlaeminck, Vos, Van der Poel? There is one man, I think. A man who claims to have 400 victories. 400 times he raised his hands aloft. A simple man, a kind man, a good man from the fields of Flanders. A man called Albert van Damme. Albert Berten van Damme was born on the 1st of December 1940 in the village of Laarne, just east of Ghent in Belgium. Berten's family grew flowers and from the age of 13 or so he'd help out on the farm. That was until he discovered the bicycle. It was his older brother Daniel who originally introduced him to the two wheels, but quickly it was Berten who noticed that he was pretty darn good at it. In 1959, at the age of 19, Berten would race his first recorded official race in Bornem near Antwerp, finishing second, 10 seconds behind Charles van Houten. It would take a mere 7 more races for Berten to hit on target for the first time, taking a very first victory in Wannehem-Lede in 1959 as well. During these early years, Berten would remain an amateur, up until 1962 in fact. Van Damme's rise to the top would be a gradual one. By 1960 he'd make his debut at the National Championships with a 7th place in Everbeek. In 1961 his World Championships debut would come with a 9th place in Hanover, all the while picking up podiums and wins throughout Belgium, including in races as prestigious as Middelkerke and Overijse, and in his hometown of Laarne too. For 1962, Berten signed a deal to join the Dr. Man Labo team, gaining some form of backing for the first time. Interestingly though, he wouldn't turn professional. He would keep working on the farm every single day between training rides. Maybe it was this work on the farm that set him in such good shape, because in 1962 he'd take another step forward, finishing on the podium of the National Championships for the first time. And can you guess what he did a year later, in 1963? He'd sweep to a very first Belgian title, proving that the time of Roger de Klerk and Firmin van Kerboek was done, and a new generation had come, and Berten was leading that charge. On the day he'd beat Jos Matthewsen and Pierre Kunst to the podium, but the one name he'd get very familiar with in the near future would be just behind his brother Daniel, in 7th place on the day. A young kid called Erik de Vlaeminck. Throughout 64 and 65, Berten would continue to show up at cross races week in, week out, consistently growing as a competitor, racking up victories across Belgium. In 64 the world came to Overboulare, home soil, where Berten would collect a first ever World Championships top 5. In 65, he'd take another Belgian title. Slowly but surely, he'd cross paths more and more often with de Vlaeminck, the two starting to dominate domestically, and by 1966, the two's duels would take centre stage, captivating a nation. Where Erik de Vlaeminck would become known for his technique, Berten would be a man of sheer power, blowing straight through any obstacle that was in his way. And by 66, de Vlaeminck had taken a first world title, Berten a 3rd Belgian title, and the two's drive to win, and almost equally importantly, their drive not to lose to one another, had started to lead to numerous infamous exchanges. One such exchange took place in Oostakker. Snow had cancelled a road race, and so de Vlaeminck had decided last minute that he was going to race cross, a race where Berten was already on the start line. However, Erik would still have his road bike, unsuited for the heavy conditions. As the two broke clear, de Vlaeminck would refuse to take over, refuse to pull at the front of the group, eventually leading a bemused and slightly annoyed Van Damme to pull over at the top of the hill, and just wait. Neither wanted to ride for the other, Berten signalling to Erik he should take over, but stubborn as they were, neither one did. They'd spend some 5 minutes atop this hill, just looking at each other, wondering what's going on. The kind of surreal, bizarre thing that would only happen in sport in the 60s. They completely refused to give each other an inch. Over the years, through 66, 67, 68 and 69 up until 1970, the two would be almost equals, sharing up Belgian titles between them, Berten claiming a 4th and a 5th in 66 and 70. But at the Worlds for Berten, it would never quite click. Erik would saunter to title after title, winning them in 66, 68 and 69, while Berten would constantly come unstuck with rotten luck and illnesses. But with the Worlds coming to Zolder in 1970, on home soil, it was time for another attempt, and maybe this time, things would go his way. Berten meant business in Zolder, flying straight off the line. Only Erik, his brother Roger de Vlaeminck, and the German 3-time world champion Rolf Wolfshol are able to follow. As the race continues, first Roger and then Wolfshol get dropped, leaving once more the two rivals together all the way until the final lap. They've crossed swords so many times, but never with this much the rainbow jersey on the line. Through the final sandpit, Berten loses maybe 10 metres to Erik. A second, nothing more. Erik pushes the whole way round. A 4th title is surely his as he sits up to celebrate on the line. Berten though is still roaring behind him, sprinting to his wheel and even pulling alongside. And it's a tube length. That's all. The closest finish in the history of the World Championships. A tube length that would cost Berten the world title. Again he'd been foiled, coming closer than anyone ever had without taking the title. And this loss, combined with all that earlier misfortune, would start to play on Berten's mind. The powerhouse starting to wonder if he ever would get his chance at the biggest prize in cross. Having missed out on the title once more, Berten's head dropped ever so slightly, whilst that of de Vlaeminck would only rise higher, growing another level. In Apeldoorn 12 months later, the battle would come down to those two once more. They'd be more than 2.5 minutes clear of a 3rd place Roger de Klerk, and in another blow to Berten's belief, he would have to bow his head once more. Another 2nd place, and another missed opportunity. 1972 would go similarly, Berten again settling for 2nd best throughout the season, missing out on a Belgian national title, and at the World Championships de Vlaeminck would win again as well. Berten this time just missing the podium in a 4th place. Now pushing his 30s, Berten knew that he wouldn't have many opportunities left, and 1973 provided what may well be the last real chance. Erik had been forced to deal with the recent passing of his close friend Jean-Pierre Montserrat, falling into a deep depression and even going AWOL for a short while. At the Belgian Nationals, Berten and Erik crossed paths for the first time that season, and finally it looks like Berten has the upper hand. The Nationals would be a walkover, Van Damme putting some 4 minutes into his nearest competitor, lapping all but 4 riders as de Vlaeminck would fail to finish the race. Weeks later at the World Championships in London, this was it. This was the moment. Berten had come closer than anybody else before to this success, and now he would finally do it. Finally take that rainbow jersey. He was convinced. As they start the race, Berten and Erik are joined by Rolf Wolfshol and André Wilhelm, but the German and the Frenchman get dropped quite quickly, leaving the two alone once more out front. Erik being surprisingly strong. The course at Crystal Palace Park in West London had one steep long hill in it, too steep to ride, forcing everyone off. Everyone apart from a magical Erik de Vlaeminck, who somehow would just glide up that hill. Berten literally seeing his chances ride off into the sunset. Again he'd come unstuck as de Vlaeminck took a 7th title, Becoming Belgium's pretty boy, the public hero, Van Damme came home fourth, his chances again destroyed, wondering what on earth he'd have to do to get his just reward. The answer would be to keep believing. Another season later, Berten would have dominated once more, fighting out many great battles with de Vlaeminck. However, by the Worlds, held in the Spanish Vera de Bidasoa, Berten would not be racing against Erik. However, de Vlaeminck would still be there. As Erik was struggling again, unable to find form, he chose not to compete to defend his title. Berten would instead be looking at the younger of the two brothers, Roger de Vlaeminck, a man who at the time had already won Liège-Bastogne-Liège, Paris-Roubaix, Milan-San Remo, and been the amateur cyclocross world champion back in 1968. As the race starts, Berten immediately heads to the front. He feels calm, collected, more so than he usually does, and as the laps tick over, he notices that he's able to gap de Vlaeminck without too much effort. And on lap 5 of the race, he decides to make his move, finding himself with a small gap and just dieseling away into the distance and towards that very first world title. After years of trying, 2 silver medals, so many failures almost to not quite, Albert Van Damme was going to be world champion, a crowning achievement for his stellar career.
Je hebt er zo lang jaren naar gezocht. En in één keer echt hoor, maar bij zijn moment vat het dan niet. Je zit met zodanig veel dingen bezig dat je zegt, allee, uiteindelijk als er een keer wat komt, en dan nog wat voor, en dan nog wat voor. Met zulke gedachten zijn dan bezig. Hè.
Maar het was waar.
Dat was waar, ja. Ja, en dan zoekt u je vrouw en je dingen en al. En uiteindelijk gelukkig mijn moeder er een keer bij. Dat is wel goed.
In the rainbow bands, Berten would shine once more, getting to raise his arms aloft another 12 times over the year, where his long-standing rivalry with Erik de Vlaeminck came back for one last time. Over the final 3 years of his career, Berten would continue to operate near the top of races, taking podiums at the Belgian Nationals and regular top 10s at the World Championships, of course dominating usually in the domestic scene, all the way until 1978, when in Oostakker, just up the road from his home in Laarne, he would race his very last cross. A cross that he would of course win. At some 38 years of age, Van Damme would say enough, hang up his wheels for good on a thoroughly dignified career. Berten never rode as a full-time professional. He got paid for his racing of course, but he never rode as a full-time professional. He got paid for his racing of course, but he always combined racing with his day job on the floristry of his parents. Heavy intensive labour. Berten would always say that in 30 years work, he did the work of someone who was 160. In his retirement, Berten would keep working at the floristry, settling down into family life with his wife and kids. He's always been a somewhat unassuming figure. You wouldn't think he was amongst the best cyclists Belgium has ever had, preferring the comfortable and quiet life. Now aged 81, Berten is still as good and content as ever, occasionally sharing his opinions on the current goings on in cross, but largely just doing his thing on his farm. Over his 20 years racing, Van Damme won in the hundreds. He himself states around 400 victories. I've heard Roger de Vlaeminck mention this number too, and I'm fairly trusting of it being true. The most complete palmarès I was able to find, bear in mind this was about 40 years ago, is a palmarès that states 311 career wins, which even that is a ridiculous amount. Of course, Berten precedes all of the major competitions, so you can't really judge him on those and compare him to the modern crossers in that sense. What you can judge him on are his world title and his 6 Belgian national titles. For those Belgian titles, only Sven Nys and Roland Liboton can claim to have won more. He is, quite clearly, right near the top of the best Belgian crossers of all time. Albert van Damme is simply a machine, having a seemingly bottomless pit of energy and endless reserves of power to push himself through anything that stood in his way. In his own words, his 3 hearts and however many lungs meant that he was basically never tired. Whilst Van Damme was naturally gifted in the mud and in other power related courses, he of course excelled across the board, on the easier to ride courses too, likely because his power always remained the same. Whilst Erik de Vlaeminck went down in history as possibly the greatest crosser ever, Berten has been criminally overlooked by anybody outside of Belgium. Whilst Erik may have the flashiness, the technique, the world titles, Berten had the sense, energy and outright more victories. Berten van Damme is the ultimate reliable racer. He never faltered. He was the simple farmer's boy who never became a full professional, as he did not drop his other commitments. Van Damme is certainly a true cyclocross legend.